Hello, everybody. We're together again. We're having yet another opportunity to study the Bible, God's Word together via WOW Live, Word on Wednesdays Live. I am happy that you're here. Tonight, we're on our 14th lesson in the series, Daniel, Prophet in Exile. We're going to be studying Daniel chapter 11 this evening. And I believe that I have given this lesson a very curious title, From Daniel to the Antichrist, Part 1. Hey, that intrigues me, okay? Let's get started. In Daniel chapter 11, the angel messenger of God that we met back in chapter 10 delivers God's prophetic message for Daniel concerning the future of his people Israel. So it's talking about Israel. You'll think for a while that chapter 11 is not talking about Israel, but just give it a moment. The first verse of Daniel 11 is actually the continuation of a thought from the last verse of Daniel chapter 10. So I just wanted to put them together and read them together. Verse 21, the last part of it actually, it's a parenthetical statement, okay, in parentheses. No one upholds me against these except Michael, your prince. Also, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, the angel says, stood up to confirm and strengthen him. Now, back in verse 1 of chapter 10, we read there that Daniel had this vision during the third year of Cyrus, the king of Persia. Of course, that was also Darius's third year. When the angel says here that he was confirming and strengthening Darius during the first year, he's therefore pointing out how he assisted Darius 2 years prior to him coming to give Daniel this vision. Okay? Now, the rest of chapter 11 comprises 44 more verses, and that's why this is part 1, and there's a part 2. I divided this chapter into 2 lessons, so we're just going to cover part of it up through verse 28 tonight. So when you know I'm getting close to 28, we're getting close to the end. In his study Bible, John MacArthur gives a kind of an overview of Daniel 11, verse 2, all the way through Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1. He says, this prophecy sweeps all the way from the history of spiritual conflict in Israel, verses 2 through 35, to the tribulation, verses 36 through 42, when Michael aids in fully delivering Israel, chapter 12 and verse 1. And here's the part that I wanted you to especially get. He says, the detail of this history is so minute and accurate, so confirmed by history, that unbelieving critics have, without evidence, insisted that it was actually written 400 years later than Daniel, after it had happened, which would of course make the prophet a deceiver. The prophecy actually looks ahead from Daniel to the final Antichrist, and thus the title of my lessons here. So what we have with chapter 11, it covers this length of time, and it is so amazing. You know, in one sense, when you hear this, it's going to sound something like a boring history lesson of kings back and forth fighting. But this is what the prophecy says a couple hundred years or more before what we discussed tonight actually happened. So it's really talking about how incredibly accurate this prophecy is, as Dr. MacArthur was saying here. Verse 2, okay, verse 2 says, and now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Prophecy is history written in advance. And this is where history and prophecy meet, because this has been fulfilled. There were indeed 3 more kings who arose out of Persia after Cyrus. There was Cambyses, circa 530 to 522 BC. There was a guy by the name of Pseudo-Smerdis. That pseudo is great. Smerdis, what a great name. S-M-E-R-D-I-S. Actually, it's a crazy name. He was in there around 522 BC. He ruled illegitimately for 7 months. And then the third king, Darius, histaspes. That's a lot of histaspes. I'm not even sure if I'm saying it right. But he went from 522 to about 486 BC. And then the angel tells Daniel that a fourth king would come after these three, and he shall be far richer than them all. And this was Xerxes I, also known as Ahasuerus. Xerxes I, or Ahasuerus, he was the king who married Esther from the book of Esther, right? And he ruled from 486 to 465 BC. Now, the prophecy then says that this fourth king, Xerxes I, shall stir up all the realms, all against the realm, I should say. He'll stir up all against the realm of Greece by means of his strength and his riches. From 481 to 479 BC, about 2 or 3 years there, Xerxes attempted a military campaign against Greece, but it failed. And so this was the beginning of the end of the Medo-Persian Empire. Think about those prophecies we've talked about already in Daniel in chapter 2 and chapter 7 that talked about these changing of the kings, the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks, and then the Romans, okay? And this is kind of details about how some of that all comes about. Anyway, things went downhill for the Medes and the Persians at this point, and ultimately in 331, Persia fell to Greece under Alexander the Great. And that brings us to the next verse 3, which was a prophecy when it was written. It's history for us. Verse 3 says, "Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will." And what a great description of Alexander the Great. This mighty king is indeed Alexander the Great. After Alexander died in about 323 BC, 4 generals basically divide up his empire. 19th century Seventh-day Adventist by the name of Uriah Smith, in his book, Daniel and the Revelation, says this about Alexander. Within 15 years after his death, all his posterity, his children, his family, had fallen victims to the jealousy and ambition of his leading generals. Not one of the race or family of Alexander was left to breathe upon the earth. So short is the transit from the highest pinnacle of earthly glory to the lowest depths of oblivion and death. The kingdom was rent into 4 divisions and taken possession of by Alexander's 4 ablest, or perhaps most ambitious and unprincipled generals, Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. Verse 4 of Daniel 11 describes exactly this scenario that we just read about here. Verse 4 says this, "And when he has arisen," this is the Persian king, or rather this is the Alexander the Great. "When he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others besides these." Alexander's kingdom was indeed broken up into 4 divisions, as we said, but it wasn't divided among his posterity, meaning his descendants. Rather, 4 of his ambitious generals, Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy, they took the kingdom apart, tore it apart, really, by force and by treachery. You see, Alexander the Great died young. He's there on his deathbed, okay? At about age 33, they believe that he might have had malaria. As he lay dying, so history records, he was asked who he desired to rule his kingdom, and he replied, "Give it to the strong." Well, that just is a challenge, right? In their book, The Handwriting on the Wall, David Jeremiah and C.C. Carlson wrote of Alexander's posterity. Alexander didn't have any heirs. He had an illegitimate son, that's not an heir, okay, and a legitimate son, the latter of whom was born after Alexander's death, and his brother was mentally retarded. Shortly after Alexander died, all 3 of these were murdered. And that's why Mr. Davis said that there was no breath left in them, right? Listen to Daniel 11:4 once again in light of all this. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the four winds of heaven, those generals, but not among his posterity, his two sons and his brother, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be uprooted even for others besides these. Do you see what's happening here? Practically with every verse of Daniel chapter 11, future history is being outlined in some detail. I've heard prophecies from Nostradamus. Maybe you've watched some of those programs or read some books or whatever, or magazine articles or whatever about Nostradamus. And his prophecies they're the kind of obscure gibberish that can be taken all different kinds of ways. It could be this, could be that, and people try to make it fit certain thing. I think there's a prophecy about Hister, Hister, and they try to make it fit Hitler and so forth. It's kind of weird. This is just like saying, this is what happens. This happens. This is how it takes place. What we've seen so far has been fulfilled at every point of detail. This is a remarkable passage of Scripture. It's no wonder that Bible critics were particularly upset about this and had to try to explain it away. Throughout the rest of this chapter, you're going to see references to the king of the north and the king of the south. The compass points we read about in this chapter are north and south relative to Israel, Daniel's people. That's what the prophecy about. This is what's going to happen to your people. All these things are going to take place right around your nation. And it's true, north and south. So it is with Alexander dead and gone that we next read then about the king of the south, verse 5. Also the king of the south shall become strong, as well as one of his princes. And he shall gain power over him and have dominion, and his dominion shall be a great dominion. Now, this king of the south is the ruler of Egypt, okay? Ptolemy. Ptolemy was one of Alexander's generals, one of those four who divided up his kingdom after his death. Egypt, of course, was part of Alexander's kingdom. There's an Alexandria, Egypt in ancient history, had a big library there. The Septuagint was likely translated in Alexandria, Egypt. That's the Greek version of the Old Testament in about 200 years before Christ. Anyway, General Ptolemy became ruler over both Egypt and also the region of Palestine, okay, Daniel's home territory. And since his rule was centered in Egypt, Ptolemy is the king of the south in Daniel 11:5. And keep in mind, all this is transpiring about 250 years after the time that the prophecy was given by this angel to Daniel. Let's talk then a little bit about the king of the north before we go any further. One of the other four generals was a man named Seleucus, and Seleucus was the king of the north. He acquired Syria, north of Israel. Seleucus, however, had some troubles early on in his empire. It eventually got so bad, he had to flee for his life. And so he's on the run, he's on the lam, he's in exile. And to seek refuge, Seleucus went to Egypt, the land of his old friend Ptolemy. And Ptolemy took him in, he gave Seleucus a position in his government of great influence, and Ptolemy then also provided Seleucus with funding and with some military aid, enabling Seleucus to go back to conquer Syria, to take back his kingdom. And he was so successful this time that he eventually became even more powerful than his benefactor Ptolemy. So take another look now at verse 5 with this information in mind. Ptolemy, king of the south, he became strong. So did Seleucus, one of his princes, one of his co-rulers. Ptolemy had put him in that position. And Ptolemy aided him then in retaking his kingdom. Seleucus did indeed eventually gain more power than what Ptolemy had, and he had dominion over him. You see the prophecy of verse 5 right on the mark. It's amazing. Now, one thing that sometimes muddies our study of history, it's study muddying. That's the technical term, I think. One of the things that muddies our study of history is the similarity of names that you encounter, especially when it comes to kings. The kingdom of the south that we've been discussing is the Ptolemaic Empire, named after, of course, Ptolemy, the guy we've been talking about down there. Alexander's general, the original Ptolemy. And of course, he's known as Ptolemy the First, implying there'll be a second, third, and so forth. Likewise, the kingdom of the north is known to historians as the Seleucid Empire, named after Seleucus, who we talked about as well. And he is, of course, known as Seleucus the First. What that all means is there are more King Ptolemies and more King Seleucuses to come. So sit tight. Here we go. Since Daniel 11 covers an expanse of future history, we're going to be looking at some different kings here. Even though the chapter keeps mentioning the king of the south and the king of the north time and time again, for example, don't think every time you read the king of the south in Daniel 11 that it's talking about the same guy. It's not. There's a different guy coming in to become king every so often. And the same way with that phrase, king of the north. There'll be different kings there, but every one of them is a king of the north for a time. So, with that in mind then, here is verse 6 of Daniel 11. And at the end of some years, they shall join forces. The north and the south are going to try to get together. For the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of her authority. Neither he nor his authority shall stand. But she shall be given up with those who brought her, and with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times. So here we begin with a new generation of kings. The angel even says this happens at the end of some years. So there's a time frame involved, a time lapse in between. The southern king and the northern king draw up an alliance of some sort, and the daughter of the southern king goes to the king of the north in order to seal this alliance. But as the angel predicts, the daughter's power doesn't last, and her mission on this alliance fails. And as a result, her father's power doesn't stand either. In fact, the daughter and all associated with her are handed over. So, what does all of this mean? Well, I would like to read to you from a passage about this from a really good commentary I have on the book of Daniel. It's written by Damon R. Duck, who is not a Disney character, a great prophecy teacher actually, and Larry Richards. They say this: by this time, by the time it comes around to these two kingdoms trying to get together, 50 or more years had passed since the other guys. The king of the south was an Egyptian king named Ptolemy Philadelphus. The king of the north was a Seleucid who called himself Antiochus Theos, Antiochus the god. Nothing like being humble, right? The two kingdoms were having trouble getting along, and these two kings wanted to change things. They thought it would be wise to forge an alliance, so Ptolemy Philadelphus offered to let his daughter, a girl named Bernice, marry Antiochus Theos. There was just one problem. Antiochus Theos divorced his wife, Laodice, and disowned their children, and he quickly then married Bernice, and the alliance was sealed. But it wasn't long after that till Ptolemy Philadelphus, Bernice's dad, died. Antiochus then changed the status of Bernice, whom he'd married, to a concubine, or least favored wife, and he remarried Laodice. And although Laodice married him, she wanted revenge, and so she poisoned Antiochus, had Bernice murdered, and named one of her sons king. Thus, the attempt to forge an alliance was a total failure. Sounds kind of like a movie of the week, doesn't it? All we need is to bring in Peter Falk, right, as Columbo. Maybe he just turns around from the door and he says, "Oh, by the way, Laodice, there's just one more thing I can't figure out. Maybe you can help me understand. How is it that I found a bottle of hemlock in your medicine cabinet? The very same poison that killed your husband. Ironic, ain't it?" Well, enough of that drama. Let's move on to verse 7. As a lead-in to this, the end of verse 6 has that prophecy about Bernice the daughter of the king of the south, it says, she shall be given up with those who brought her, and with him who begot her, her dad, and with him who strengthened her in those times. And verse 7 then says, but from a branch of Bernice's roots, her roots, one shall arise in his place, her father's place, who shall come with an army, enter the fortress of the king of the north, and deal with them and prevail. So the soap opera continues concerning Bernice, Laodice, and company. Okay, Bernice's father, the one who died, was Ptolemy Philadelphus. And when he died, his son, Ptolemy Euergetes, assumed the throne in Egypt. He was Bernice's brother. And he was upset over what had happened to her in all this mess. And so he decided to have his revenge. And as this verse 7 prophesies, he took a large army to the fortress of the king of the north, which was the kingdom of Syria, and he conquered the Syrians there. And then he dealt with Laodice, capturing her and putting her to death. I guess maybe Colombo was working for this king. Verse 8 tells us that Euergetes did not stay in Syria for long. He shall also carry their gods captive to Egypt, with their princes and their precious articles of silver and gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So Euergetes planned to overthrow all of Syria. He was going to basically try to add it to his kingdom. But he receives word that in his absence, there was an uprising back home in Egypt. Cats away, mice start to play. And Euergetes grabs all the spoil he could get, and he takes it all back to Egypt. Included in that booty were some 2,500 Syrian idols. Thus, as the verse says, he carried their gods captive back to Egypt. Now, what we're seeing here, folks, is not just a rehearsal of historic events. Understand what we're seeing. We're seeing the sinful heart of mankind being played. It's why you have episodes of Columbo and every other detective and cop show you can possibly think about, plus a whole lot of other programs. The sinful heart of mankind is played out over the course of history. Tying all this in with what we've been looking into in the Sunday sermons as Bible believers, where the angelic hosts who have rebelled have control over the nations and they're in cahoots with the wicked leadership of those nations, we should not assume that our own day with our own leaders is going to be any different than this. The lust for power, the lust for wealth, the consequent formation of foolish alliances and treaties. I mean, you sometimes look at somebody in government or leadership and they do something totally whack. Like, where did that come from? Why are they doing that? That's so stupid. You have to think about who else they have to please. People we don't know about. People they've got to keep happy, people that they've made an alliance with. I'll give you so much money if, when the time comes, you do such and such. That kind of thing, right? The need to seek revenge. The foolish idolatries, worshiping things that don't need to be worshipped. All these things and more have driven and have motivated kings and czars and dictators and presidents and senators and Caesars and pharaohs and congressmen and others throughout all of history. Their choices and the consequences of them have been tragic indeed. See, the Bible gives the best description of this. We live in a sinful, fallen world, and it's only too evident. Verse 9, also the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. So again, fulfilling this prophecy, there was a Syrian king in the north by the name of Callinicus, who tried to attack Egypt, but he failed, and he had to return home. And so it's just kind of a almost footnote there, but there it is, verse 9 prophesied. Verse 10, however, his sons, Callinicus' sons, shall stir up strife, and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come, and overwhelm and pass through. And then he shall return to his fortress and stir up strife. Callinicus had two sons, Cyrannus and his brother, named Antiochus the Great. and together they stirred up a conquering army. Cyrannus was killed. The remaining brother, Antiochus, certainly came, overwhelmed, and passed through as he became king in his brother's place. He won a great victory over the Egyptians at Gaza, the very same Gaza that's in the news today, even as we speak. That's where this was happening. Now, from there, Antiochus hoped to conquer all of Egypt. Verse 11, "And the king of the south shall be moved with rage, and go out and fight with him, with the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude. But the multitude shall be given into the hand of his enemy." Now, Ptolemy Philopater, who was the son of Ptolemy Euergetes, remember he was Bernice's brother that went for revenge and everything. Ptolemy Philopater was their, Philopater maybe, I'm not sure, was the king of Egypt, or the king of the south. Philopater sounds crazy. I'm going to say Philopater from now on, even that's kind of weird. He had a bad temper, Philopater did, and got very angry when the fortress at Gaza fell. I can't get any of these names right now. He struck back and defeated the great Syrian or northern army. Verse 12, "When he has taken away the multitude, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cast down tens of thousands, but he will not prevail." History tells us that Philopater grew prideful over his victory over Antiochus the Great, and he killed some 10,000 Syrians, and he took thousands of others away as prisoners. In his pride, he did not push on to conquer Syria. Foolishly, as far as looking for his right political gain and stuff is concerned, foolishly, he made a peace treaty with Antiochus. There's a wonderful Bible teacher by the name of Oliver B. Green, and he once wrote about this event. He said, because of this tremendous victory, Ptolemy Philopater's heart was lifted up. And had he been a man of character, he might have followed up this victory by fighting Antiochus and seizing his kingdom, but he was too anxious to return to his drinking and sensual pleasures. He liked the high life, and thereby lost the opportunity to drive on to complete victory and become a world ruler. Therefore, as the verse says, he was not strengthened by his great victory over Antiochus. He defeated the king, but he did not take the kingdom. Verse 13 says, "For the king of the north will return, and muster a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come at the end of some years with a great army and much equipment." After signing the peace treaty with Philopater of Egypt, because remember that's what he wanted instead of taking everything over, Antiochus of Syria took his army back home, and he began a program to rebuild his military. See, this is where Philopater made his mistake, see. He began to use this great army to make forays into surrounding areas, thus gaining strength and resources, much equipment. Word soon arrived that the Egyptian king Philopater was dead. Philopater's son, now this is a great one, Epiphanes, was only 5 years old at the time and was crowned king of Egypt. Antiochus saw an opportunity here, no doubt, and moved to attack Egypt. In verse 14, we see now how Daniel's people, the Jews, start to get involved in this constant battling back and forth. Actually, they've been involved all the way along. It just hasn't been mentioned. Bear in mind that since the time after Alexander the Great's death, these armies would have been constantly moving, Syrian from the north, Egyptian from the south, back and forth through the land of Israel. This is why Israel literally is at the center of all of this activity. And that's why the prophecy concerns Daniel's people, you see. Verse 14 says, "Now in those times many shall rise up against the king of the south. Also violent men of your people shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, but they shall fail. Many shall rise up against the south." Quite frankly, a lot of the key citizens in Egypt, they were ticked off that the 5-year-old Epiphanes was crowned king. All right, it's not too hard to figure out that a kindergartner can't govern a country, so somebody else is obviously in power. All right, the hope amongst these people in Egypt was to raise up an insurrection. Now, there were Jews living and working in Egypt, okay, and they had connections with Jews back in Israel. And the Jews were siding with the Egyptian insurrectionists to overthrow the current administration of power in Egypt. They also figured, with Antiochus of Syria also coming to the party, they're going to have the Jews, there's going to be the insurrectionists, and Antiochus is coming in with his big army. This is going to be an easy victory to accomplish. But, neither the Egyptian insurrectionists nor the Syrians had figured on another force entering the picture: Rome. You see, those in power in Egypt had at some point struck up a mutual aid treaty with Rome. You guys get in trouble, we'll come help you. If we get in trouble, you come help us. Scratch each other's back. Rome had become quite powerful at this time, and we're seeing the rise of Rome as a force to be reckoned with here. And the Syrians, even with the Egyptian insurrectionists on their side, had no chance of winning this one. In verse 4 of Daniel 11, we have this interesting statement. Your people, the Jews, Daniel's people, your people shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision. Remember, we had said back when we were studying that amazing prophecy in Daniel 9, that the people of the ruler who will come, that they would destroy Jerusalem and the temple after the anointed one, the Christ, was cut off or killed, after Jesus was crucified. And of course they did that. The Romans came in and destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. Those people of the ruler who would come were the Romans. And you see here in this prophecy in Daniel 11:4, the fulfillment of that vision begins to play out. As she sides with Egypt here, Rome comes into the Middle East as a military power for the first time. It was the first time that Rome comes into Israel. It was in the providence of God that Rome came to Egypt's aid in this battle. Verse 15, so the king of the north shall come and build a siege mound and take a fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not withstand him. Even his choice troops shall have no strength to resist. Mr. Duck and Mr. Richards comment on this verse in their commentary. They say the rebellion resulting from crowning a 5-year-old boy as king of Egypt and the insurrection of the Jews greatly weakened Egypt. And this was just what Antiochus wanted, so he set out to attack Egypt. Unfortunately for Antiochus, the Romans had entered the picture, and they had one of their experienced ministers serving as guardian and assistant to the young king. Now we get some idea about who's probably been running Egypt the whole time. There's a Roman guy with the kindergarten kid, all right? He called on a famous Egyptian general named Scopas to come and help. Scopas quickly organized an army and went out to meet Antiochus the Great, but he wasn't strong enough, and Antiochus defeated his army. After defeat, Scopas and a few of his troops fled to the fortress city of Sidon, but Antiochus the Great pursued them and laid siege to that city. Egypt got word and sent troops to help, but they were not strong enough to defeat Antiochus either. He defeated them, starved out the besieged Egyptians, captured the fortress city of Sidon, and sent the surviving troops away stark naked. Everything the angel said was accomplished. Verse 16, but he who comes against him shall do according to his own will, and no one shall stand against him. He shall stand in the glorious land, capital G, capital L, with destruction in his power. The glorious land in this verse is, of course, Israel. Remember that even though these prophecies we've been looking at have all been about Syria and Egypt, the angel's real focus for Daniel was his people, the Jews. And we saw how these back and forth battles and marching armies are all moving through Israel's land regularly. And now they're kind of becoming an important part of the structure here. Antiochus the Great knew that Egypt was weak, but the Egyptians had this mutual aid treaty with Rome. Rome had warned Antiochus to leave Egypt alone. He decided to bide his time, so he settled down in Israel, the glorious land. Antiochus could have conquered Israel, but chose not to because the Jews had helped him in bonding with the Egyptian insurrectionists, or joining them in the fight. Now, I know history is not everyone's favorite topic. Some of you are probably just like this guy by now. I urge you to keep in mind, our focus, even though we're talking about history, is these prophecies in Daniel, that they are written well in advance of the historical events we're covering, and it's almost like having a running commentary on what's happening by some observer there, like a guy with a microphone and a camera, right? Keep in mind that in these details we are catching a glimpse of how amazing God is, how remarkably accurate His Word is, how much sovereignty He knows. If He knows all this about these people and all that's happening, He knows what's going on with you. Take great comfort in that. Verse 17, He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do. And he shall give him the daughter of women to destroy it, but she shall not stand with him or before him. So, Antiochus, king of Syria, decided to try something at this point. He wanted to give the appearance to Egypt that he was making a gesture of peace. The young Egyptian king, Epiphanes, by this time he's about 7 years old, Antiochus had a daughter who was somewhat older than Epiphanes, maybe about 5 or 6 years older, and her name was Cleopatra. And here's the old name thing again, not the same as the famous Cleopatra who had a relationship with Mark Antony more than a century later. Egypt actually had 7 different queens, all named Cleopatra. Come on, be original or something, Anyway, Antiochus suggested that peace be made between Syria and Egypt, and he offered his daughter Cleopatra to be the wife of Epiphanes. Secretly, he hoped his daughter would gain the advantage over the young king, would be loyal to her father, and thus bring Egypt under Antiochus' control. But there was one thing Antiochus hadn't counted on. Cleopatra actually fell in love with Epiphanes. So she did not, as the verse says, stand with her father. Wouldn't this make a great movie? Somebody's missing an opportunity on a great story here. Verse 18, chapter 11. Maybe they did make a movie of it. I don't know. After this, he shall turn his face to the coastlands, the king of the north, the Syria, and he shall take many. But a ruler shall bring the reproach against them to an end, and with the reproach removed, he shall turn back on him. Antiochus got impatient and angry. His daughter betrayed him. Rome thwarted his ambitions with their stubborn protection of Egypt. And so he organizes a navy of 300 ships, and he begins to take cities and islands along the Mediterranean coasts. However, these were under Roman control, and the Romans set out to defend their territory. Scipio had commanded a fleet of Roman warships that fell upon the Syrian vessels, sinking most of them. There goes your navy, Antiochus' reproach, as the verse says, came to an end. Verse 19, Then he shall turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. Again, Duncan Richards' comment. Antiochus the Great returned home with one eye over his shoulders. He expected the Roman army to be right on his heels. As soon as he got home, he sent messengers to Rome seeking peace. The Romans had the upper hand and were in no mood to be generous. They offered peace, but at a very high price. Antiochus the Great had to give them all the territory he controlled in Europe, a big chunk of what he controlled in Asia, all but 10 of his warships, an enormous tribute, and then heavy taxes every year for the next 12 years. Well, he agreed to their terms, but had trouble coming up with the money and was killed while trying to seize it a few months later. Like so many great leaders, Antiochus, undone by taxes. Verse 20, There shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom. But within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not in anger or in battle. Seleucus Philopator, son of Antiochus, inherited his father's debt to Rome. He raised taxes, but the Syrian nation was impoverished. He wasn't able to garner the funds that way. So in desperation, he sent authorities to Jerusalem to confiscate the gold and silver vessels of the temple, thus imposing taxes on the glorious kingdom. Shortly after this, Seleucus Philopator was poisoned. Oh boy. One thing we can take from all of this intrigue and drama: sin doesn't pay. Well, in a way it does. But what does the Bible say is the payment for sin? The wages of sin is death. And I guess Seleucus Philopator got his wage. Verse 21, and in his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty. But he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. As this verse says, a vile person now enters the scene. Vile the letters can be rearranged. Take the E from the end, put it on the front, you have evil. Evil, vile, yeah. Seleucus Philopator had a son by the name of Demetrius. Now Demetrius was in line to become the king, but as the prophecy says, the one who would take Seleucus' place was not one who was due the honor of royalty. Somebody else is going to take it. Instead, it would be Seleucus' younger brother. His name was also Antiochus, son of Antiochus the Great, and sister to Cleopatra, wife of Epiphanes. So Antiochus Jr. worked through deceit to take the crown from his nephew Demetrius. Antiochus later became known as Antiochus Epiphanes. This is a very significant individual as far as the Bible is concerned, and prophecy especially. Antiochus Epiphanes is widely recognized by Bible prophecy teachers as a precursor or living example or forerunner of the Antichrist. In this flow chart on Daniel 11, you get kind of an outline of where we've been, conflicts of kings in the north and the south, where we presently are at Antiochus Epiphanes, and where we're headed. Verses 21 to 35 deal with this Epiphanes fella and where we're headed now. Keep that association with the Antichrist in mind. Notice how the prophecy in Daniel 11:21 says that Antiochus Epiphanes shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. It's exactly how the Antichrist will someday come in to power. We read in Revelation 13, who is able to make war with the beast? He's a man of peace. Paul says in his letter to the Thessalonians, for they shall say peace and safety. Then cometh sudden destruction. It's exactly the way Antiochus Epiphanes acts. Antiochus Epiphanes was following in his father's footsteps. He wanted Egypt. He was able to lead everyone to believe that the troop movement he was making was just a small army along the border of Egypt. We're just having, exercises out here. In truth, he was sending in a large army. And of course, they had to get through Israel to get to the border with Egypt. The great Bible teacher J. Vernon McGee gives us some insight into not only this man, but into deceivers of all kinds. He says, this prophecy is concerned with one king in the line of the Seleucidae, Antiochus Epiphanes. Most fundamental interpreters of Scripture consider this section to be a direct reference to this man. The prophecy fits the history of Antiochus Epiphanes like a glove. He is at the same time a type of the Antichrist, thus illustrative and figurative of the man of sin who is yet to come. The careers of both are strikingly similar. Antiochus Epiphanes came to the throne in 175 BC. He's called vile because of his blasphemies. He came to the throne with a program of peace. The Antichrist will come to power in the same way. He will introduce the Great Tribulation with 3.5 years of peace. And the people of the world will think they are entering the millennium when they are actually entering the Great Tribulation period. Antiochus was a deceiver and a flatterer. My friend, beware of that type of person. You can find them even in the ministry. They have hurt the church more than anything. We do not need men who will deceive and butter up folk for their own advantage. We need honest, forthright men who will stand in the pulpit and tell it like it is. Unfortunately, they are getting few and far between, but at least in his day, thank God there are still many of them about. I don't know how many there are now. I hope a lot. Verse 22, with the force of a flood, they shall be swept away from before him and broken, and also the prince of the covenant. Now, I don't seem to have that verse on here. I must have missed it somehow. Let me just check on the other side of that. Yeah, I don't have it. So, made a mistake there. But Antiochus Epiphanes now moved his huge army against Egypt. I'll read this verse again since we didn't have it on. With the force of a flood, they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. I was talking about the covenant that God's people have with him, the chief of the covenant, okay? The high person in charge of that in Israel. Antiochus Epiphanes now moves his huge army against Egypt, and a battle ensues, a terrific one. Casualties were high on both sides. But the Syrian, he prevailed. He captured the Egyptian king, who was essentially his nephew, Ptolemy Philometor, the son of his sister Cleopatra. Who is this prince of the covenant, then, with whom Antiochus Epiphanes broke trust? Possibly it was a Jewish leader, a person of the people of the covenant. A likely possibility is the Jewish high priest, Onias III. Antiochus had Onias III removed from his position and then had him killed. Antiochus then appointed Onias' brother Jason as high priest of Israel. Jason wanted the Greek culture to be established in Israel, and Antiochus supported him in this. Ultimately, Jason persuaded many Jews to abandon their faith. Well, that's just great. Verse 23, and after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and be strong with a small number of people. Antiochus Epiphanes took the Egyptian king Philometor captive. Then the Egyptians quickly crowned Philometor's brother Euergetes, once again, as their king, not the same guy. It's a different Euergetes than what we saw earlier. That other Euergetes was Bernice's brother a long time ago, right? So Euergetes was now king of Egypt. Antiochus Epiphanes, king of Syria, still lusted for power over Egypt, so he made an agreement with Philometor, the captured king, promising to restore him to power in Egypt. Essentially, it was something like this. Philometor, or Phil, hey, can I call you Phil? Phil, you help me bring down your brother Euergetes from the throne in Egypt, and I'll give your throne back to you. What do you say? Do we have a deal? But Antiochus was a lying deceiver. We don't have lying and deceiving politicians today, so it's hard for us to really understand what's happening here. But I guess they did have them back then. In any case, Philometor helped out his uncle Antiochus Epiphanes, and together they brought down Phil's brother Euergetes. For Antiochus Epiphanes, everything was going according to his diabolical plan. Verse 24, he shall enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. It's interesting. I was just hearing about this tonight in something. This is off the cuff, about how the Antichrist will take control through peace, not through war. And this is exactly what we're seeing, this description of Antiochus Epiphanes in this verse. He shall do what his fathers have not done. All the fathers were fighting, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches, and he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. See, the Egyptians now thought that peace had been restored. They were in a covenant with the Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes. Their troubles were over. But as soon as they said peace and safety, well then, Antiochus Epiphanes launched raids against some of the richest provinces in Egypt. What did I do? Get a duplicate of things? Yeah, what a crazy thing. Sorry about that. I didn't check that real careful, did I? He was able to gain territory that none of his Syrian ancestors were ever able to get, plus he got a lot of plunder and wealth besides. And he used that wealth to buy more loyalty among a greater number of men, and he planned to then plunder even more places. But things changed, and now we finally get to verse 25. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a great, very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. Intrigue and plotting, you see, bring down the king of the south. We can take Antiochus Epiphanes' career here and use it to understand exactly how the Antichrist will operate. He will buy loyalties from plunder and seize territory as well. As prophesied in verse 25 here, Antiochus Epiphanes attacked Egypt, the king of the south. The king now was yet another brother of Philometor, or Phil, that we talked about, a guy named Ptolemy Physcon. He raised a large army against the Syrian army, but some of his men were treasonous. The verse says they shall devise plans against him at the very end, and they sided with Antiochus Epiphanes. So therefore Egypt lost the battle. Verse 26, yes, those who eat the portion of his delicacies shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. So those who broke bread with Physcon are going to turn against him and destroy him. Not much is known here on this point in history, but it's likely that a number of the political appointees in Egypt were relatives of both Physcon and Philometor, or Philometor. And some of them may have chosen to side with cousin Phil. At any rate, verse 27, both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. So, Uncle Antiochus Epiphanes and nephew Philometor sat down to talk things over. But it was all a game of deceit and treachery. Both men had evil hearts, so evil came forth from both of them. They both lied to one another. Nothing of peace was ever settled. It sounds so much like the peace treaties and talks in the Middle East conflict in our day over the decades of time. Verse 28. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant. So he shall do damage and return to his own land. Again, Duck and Richard's comment. It appears that Antiochus Epiphanes, it's not going to let me do it. Oh well. It appeared that Antiochus Epiphanes and Ptolemy Philometor had settled their differences around the conference table. A large amount of Egypt's wealth was handed over to Antiochus Epiphanes, and he headed back to Syria with his army. The route home took him through Israel. Now things had changed in Israel since Antiochus Epiphanes had passed through on his way to Egypt. A rumor had circulated that Antiochus Epiphanes was dead, which caused many Jews to rejoice. And so some of them had revolted and driven the Syrians out of Jerusalem. Antiochus Epiphanes learned of this as he neared Jerusalem, and he decided to make the Jews pay. God's covenant with Israel was not something he believed anyway, so he attacked and plundered the city, killing approximately 40,000 Jews, sold thousands more into slavery, looted the temple, and let his troops rape the women. I'm thinking of a verse in Matthew 24, where Jesus says, "And when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, then flee. Get out of Jerusalem. Don't go back and get anything. Don't go upstairs, don't go down to pack clothes. Just run down the stairs outside on your roof and get out. Don't go back from the field to pick things up. And woe to those who are pregnant in those days and those who have children, because this great destruction is going to come upon the Jewish people." This is the Antichrist the middle of the tribulation. Paul says he goes in, declares himself to be God in the temple, in the holy place. That's what Jesus had said. When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, that which had been spoken about by the prophet Daniel, then flee. And that's what Paul says, that he shall declare himself to be God, saying that he is God, taking the place of God in the very holy place of God. This is yet to come. You think, why would people fall for something like that? It's going to be very different times. Why would people do what people did over this last year? Why would people so easily give in to what authorities were saying? Because it's for your own good. It'll be good for you. And maybe it was. But anybody who questioned that or had their hand up in the back of the room was shouted down, told to shut up, called a traitor, all kinds of things. It's pretty frightening when you think about it. And all of this, an explicit foreshadowing of the Antichrist to come. From Daniel to the Antichrist, part 2. That's our plan to pick up on that next week. And it may well be that next week, if things go well time-wise, we'll finish the book of Daniel next week. So hope you can join us for that last big hurrah in one of the most tremendous books, I think, in the entire library of Scripture. God bless you. Have a great week.